Thanks for joining us for the NorthBay podcast, where we explore how outdoor education is reshaping the way students learn, grow, and connect with the world around them. I'm your host, Rick Garber, and in each episode, we're going to dive into the impact of outdoor schools, the challenges and successes of bringing learning beyond four walls, and the movement to make outdoor education accessible to all. Welcome to the NorthBay podcast. I've got the great pleasure today of talking with John Erickson. John is an entrepreneur. John is a philanthropist. He's the founder of Erickson Senior Living, the Erickson School of Aging, and NorthBay, among others. John's had a huge impact on people across age spectrums, and really excited to talk to him today. Welcome, John.
Glad to be here, Rick.
So, I think I'd like to start with your childhood and hear about the formative experiences, what it was like, what kind of experiences in the outdoors and education and family led to who you are today and some of the success you've had?
Well, that's a long time ago. I see what I can remember.
Yeah.
But I was raised in a large family. There were 14 kids in our family, 11 boys and 3 girls. It was a span over 17 years with 14 kids, so we were kind of our own tribe. We always had a brother or sister just older, just younger, that you could go do something with. Yeah. So our childhood was back in the 50s and the rest, and so school days, kept going, but after school was out in the summer times, Mother would just say, get out of the house. And so we just went out and did our own things. We'd maybe pair up with one of our brothers and go find somebody to connect with. We lived right at the base of Missionary Ridge, which was one of the old Civil War, positions in the war. And so we had all these hills and stuff to hike on and climb on. And so, it was pretty active childhood in those days. We made up our own games, set our own standards. So it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. And you grew up in Chattanooga?
In Chattanooga, Tennessee.
Yeah. And were you in Chattanooga or are you outside of Chattanooga?
Right in the city itself.
Okay.
Right at the base of Missionary Ridge. Chattanooga's got 2 mountains and a ridge.
Right.
And so it's in a little valley. We were on the ridge side of the valley. So.
Okay. So, with having a family that big, that many brothers and sisters, you'd always have interaction.
Yeah, we always did. In fact, there were so many of us that we ate at 2 different tables. The big kids, we called ourselves. I was the 4th, the oldest.
You're a big kid.
So I was one of the big kids.
Yep.
And we got to eat in the dining room because our parents had to eat with all the little kids in the kitchen where they spilled all the milk and caused all the problems. So, but in the dining room, it was really nice because it was sort of like the book Lord of the Flies, where we were raising ourselves and we were setting our own rules and how we were going to operate the island. And so it was good. And we didn't always make the best of rules, but one good rule that we had in the family was no physical fighting. Right. We were not allowed to beat each other up. You could verbally abuse anybody you wanted, and you could make them as miserable as possible with your verbal onslaught, but you couldn't beat them up. So that kept a little bit of peace in the family with that many kids.
Right. So, your work has had a profound impact on education. Tell me a little bit about education in in the Erickson family and how that was, I guess, growing up. And
well, it's pretty unusual because my father dropped out of school in the 6th grade because he'd had appendicitis operation on the kitchen table in the early 1900s.
Right.
And he got some infection, and the infection affected his eyes, and he had to wear glasses after that. And he didn't want to go to school with glasses. That would have been too embarrassing, so he just dropped out of school.
Okay.
And my mother, she was pretty smart and would have definitely been college-bound, but the Depression hit.
Yeah.
And she had to stay home and help the family on the income side and never could go to college.
Okay.
But growing up, she was a driving force of education in the family. She knew that if there was one thing that would delineate how successful everybody was in the family. It was going to be education.
Yeah.
So I can't tell you how many term papers and science projects and music instruments and whatever she went through to teach us.
With 14 kids, quite a few.
Yeah, and the number of hundreds of thousands of lunches that she did.
Right.
But anyway, she was the driving force and said, you will achieve. And so for two parents that never graduated from college, it was discovered a number of years later in the 1990s by one of my sisters that all 14 of us had graduated from college.
Right.
And 9 ended up with graduate degrees, PhDs, medical degrees, law degrees, whatever. And we ended up in the Guinness Book of World Records for about 8 years, from the early 90s to the end of the 90s, for having the most college educations of any family in the world. Wow. And that's pretty amazing when you think that neither parent went to college.
Right.
And so, although I will say that as soon as the last of the kids went to grade school, mother did go back to college. Wow. And she ended up finishing with all A's, as what you expect. Right. And then, in fact, one of my sisters went to college with her. She was in the same college.
Really?
And mother was in some of the classes. She said it was terribly embarrassing to have your mother in school. You would have thought after that many term papers and science projects, you'd never want to see one again.
And being around that many kids.
That's right. That many kids. That's what she wanted to do. So education was a big thing in the family. I never really liked school though, but sort of the standard. My oldest brother was very smart and made all A's and got scholarships to multiple colleges, and he kind of was the standard bearer and set the tone for the whole family.
Right.
And so then my second brother was also pretty hardworking and smart. Well, by the time it got to me, number 4, it was like, well, I'll try to get the lowest B I can get. Right. Because I didn't get in trouble for B's, but C was, you were in trouble. Yeah. Well, I missed a few times and got in a lot of trouble, but what I found out about, if I had a great teacher, I would enjoy taking a course. Yep. And like in chemistry, I had a great teacher, and so I enjoyed all the valences and why sodium likes chloride and all the little things that connect together in chemistry. Yeah. But in biology, I had a teacher that just was a leftover football coach who didn't know much about biology, and he read out of the textbook. Right. And I got a D accidentally in that course. So I was in deep, deep trouble. I bet. But I found out that if you liked it, it was great, and you could learn something, and but I was smart enough to still stay in school and make a decent grade and that kind of thing. So and I don't want to get too far ahead of us, and I want to hear some more of the path that got you here. But when you talk about education, I think about the kind of education that NorthBay does that's engaging and fun, Right. And I think about your experience, and I see that. Obviously, that's part of what pushed me to do something like this. When you can create fun ways for kids to learn, it changes the whole dynamic of how they're going to survive and what they can put in their toolbox and what they are interested in. You have to spark that curiosity. Yeah. And so, that was definitely one of the things. But I didn't learn that early. I learned that much later. Right. That's, So tell me about the experience of really starting something. What drove you to innovate and create, and create things like Erickson Senior Living? Gee, I'm not sure where that motivation came from. I was always a person that, in school, I ended up going to a Catholic seminary and majored in philosophy. And in philosophy, you learn to think and perceive, and that did give me a kind of a view of what education is all about. Right. And then after college, I ended up doing a few years in theology and got a master's in education at Catholic University. And by that time, I was really interested in the fact that the parochial education system in America was one of the more value-based, strongest systems in the country. This was like 1965, 67, that kind of time frame. And I was thinking about going to work in that, but it was a time when the Catholic Church was going through a lot of turmoil.
Right.
And they were more concerned about losing their free nuns, which were never free in the first place.
Right.
And it just was so complicated, I decided to get out of that. And so I quit the seminary and figured, well, I'll go get a job. And in 1968, this was a time of full employment in America.
Right.
And I ended up interviewing, here I am with a philosophy degree and a theology degree and an education degree.
Right.
I interviewed with some chemical companies, an engineering company, a computer company, and all of them offered me jobs. So I took this job with a computer company, RCA. But I'd never seen a computer before in my life.
Right.
Didn't know anything about them.
Yeah.
But back then they would say, okay, we'll let you learn these things. So I ended up, my first job was at the Lockheed Martin plant in Atlanta, Georgia, in Marietta.
Okay.
And I was in a deep underground tunnel, and they had this computer there. And when I walked in, they handed me this stack of manuals about this tall. And they said, if you can read all these, you can learn what these zeros and ones do.
Right.
So sure enough, I read all those manuals, and I could sit there and type and do the thing. And next thing you know, I can make the tape drive spin and the printer print and all this kind of stuff. So I had a technical or sort of a aptitude towards how things work.
Right.
And that got me interested in sort of what I would call engineering. And that migrated into an interest in social engineering.
Right.
And I just was always interested in saying, well, how can you make this better? And I drifted into the field of senior housing back in the early 70s, but more in the Florida market with leisure housing, golf courses, community buildings. And I saw all the potlucks that they did and the good social times that they had. And I got to thinking, you know, for everybody that moves to Florida, 20 stayed home back in Baltimore and New Jersey, and they stayed home because of churches and family and community values, and you know, and that if you were going to really build senior housing, why wouldn't you do it at the place where all the people stayed, or most of the people stayed? And so I had these ideas, and they just would roll around in my head. And then one day I came across this abandoned seminary, oddly enough, not very far from where I was in school at Catholic University. And I had the idea that you could turn this into a senior housing project for maybe not the 60-year-old Florida retiree, but the 75-year-old who says, it's time to get rid of the house. It's time to, kind of figure out another stage in my life. So I launched into that and became one of the larger senior housing developers in the country.
Tell me about, so you had all this success in senior housing with Erickson Living. What motivates somebody like you to keep going and do more and come up with an idea like NorthBay and think like, how can I continue to have impact? You're having incredible impact on older people's lives.
Yes.
And to shift and say, how can I have a different impact?
So two things. One is that I never counted the success as purely mine. I felt like the success was because I was really making life better for other people. And when you get into that mode, you realize that you're not supposed to stop. If you can keep going, and I built my first project and took 10 years and I got to the end, but there were 2,500 people that would never have had the lifestyle had I not done that project.
Right.
And I had the attitude, well, it doesn't seem fair to just take the money and the success and quit.
Right.
When you had that success, you should put it back to work. And I never really considered my success as much as the opportunity that I was given. I was going to put it back to work.
Yeah.
So I started to build more communities and more communities and more communities, and ended up doing 23 of these huge campuses in 12 different states all across the country, and kept growing it. And that was just my attitude about success, is that it's not yours. It's you just been given the opportunity to make the investment go further and do something with it. And so a lot of the success of the senior housing that I was doing, I said, well, how would I have another influence? And one of them I wanted to work on was education, because that was something that was so ultimately pivotal in my life and my family's life.
Yeah.
I was thinking, I can't give them my mother, but I could give them an exciting, an exhilarating event in their life that might put a marker for them to think, like my mother would have taught us to think about. Education is the one single thing that'll make the biggest difference in your life.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to see if I couldn't put together a program to do that, and that's what NorthBay became.
So how did the idea for NorthBay come together?
Well, you'd be surprised at this story, because before I got into this Erickson Senior Living, I was doing this housing in Florida, and I ended up building an office building for a wealthy lady in Florida. And when it was over, she'd gone, she was what you call dirt poor, in that she owned a lot of land all over Florida, but she didn't have income. And so when I built the office building, now she had a fair amount of income coming in.
Right.
And she said, what I'd like to do something with this. And so she asked me to explore doing youth projects with the Department of Agriculture in the National Forest Program.
Okay.
This was back in 1981.
Okay.
And so I met with the Department of Agriculture in Washington and spoke with them about, could we do some summer investments to get kids involved? And again, this came a little bit from my experiences in growing up.
Right.
And they were very enthusiastic about it. And it was that very day that I ended up learning about this abandoned seminary
Right.
in Baltimore, and got waylaid for the next 30 years
Right.
before I did anything, because I was so busy building the senior housing.
Right.
But I never let the idea go of what impact we could have on kids.
Right.
And this actually went back to my childhood. I told you I lived in the family of 14, and we kind of were our own tribe. But I can still remember at about the age of 12 or 13 when I had my first camp experience. It was a church camp, and it was very pivotal to me.
Right.
Because now I'm being taken out of my family tribe.
Right.
And I'm going out there with all these other kids, and I'm going to spend a week or 10 days in this church camp. And I can still remember to this day how, sort of scared, and yet you were super sensitive about what you were going to learn and who you're going to be around and who might be your friend, and I was real worried about whether I could eat or not, because I was a picky eater, and
Right.
I was afraid if they didn't have peanut butter, I would die. But they did. They had peanut butter, so I lived through the 10 days.
Yeah.
But I do remember that was the first time that I really explored being around peer people like myself in a different way than I had in school or in the family.
Right.
And I remember how sensitive I was to what camp meant, and it was fun. And we did a lot of things, but it was also scary.
Right.
But the attention that you had in that environment was great. And so I thought, if you're ever going to really impact kids, you should take them out of their where they really are and get them into an environment that would be exciting,
Right.
and then you could message to them. And that was is what I thought would be behind putting a NorthBay together, is that
Right.
sort of I could give them my mother's message about education
Right.
being the delineating force in your life, but you aren't going to get that message across on a blackboard in a classroom.
Right.
You needed to create this exhilarating, unusual environment where their attention to what's going on around them is different than it's ever been.
Right.
So that was how I came up with the idea of putting this together.
It's interesting that the idea or it started to come together in 1981, and then you create this incredible success and the resources that it would take to really launch this and do this. So it seems like things happened in a really, in a really thoughtful way that we wouldn't have known at the time, but they came together.
Yeah,
And so
and
that
I look at it,
realized.
it was more of a providential way. God had been good enough to me at the multi-stages in my life to create
Right.
this huge opportunity and this success. And this was just one more way to say, that success wasn't me. It came from my mother putting up with my D grade and a few other things and all those lunches. And I can give that success back by putting something together like this NorthBay program.
So what were the challenges when you had the vision and and said go, let's do this?
Well,
What kind of challenges popped up?
so obviously the biggest challenge is where and how can you do this, and can you control the costs and structure? Well, where it became one of the most complicated ones, because obviously you want to put a camp in a fun spot. Okay, well, every time I would go to the state of Maryland or to the local jurisdiction about, how about this fun spot? Here's what's on the water. It's here. Everybody's like, oh, no, you can't touch that spot.
Right.
No, you can't do this, can't do that.
Right.
And so I tried to rejuvenate a Boy Scout camp up here in the area. We looked at some things down in the Eastern Shore, but in general, the answer was no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. But persistence usually overcomes that. And then when this NorthBay site, it was in the state park, of the Elk Neck State Park.
Yeah.
It was an underutilized space left over from an old farm that they had acquired. And it was already on the Chesapeake Bay, and it had this beach. And I thought, well, maybe I can talk them into letting me do something there.
Yeah.
And so here you have this guy who's willing to build a $40 million, enterprise camp for kids on a state park that's not utilizing their land. And I started to get enough traction with enough people to say, yeah, I think we could maybe make this work. We could maybe make this work.
Right.
And it took a few years, but I was able to push it across the line to where they say, yeah, you can actually build that.
Right.
And then, but that was the big obstacle, finding a space, getting all the approvals, because it was still within 1,000 feet of the Chesapeake Bay water line and all these things.
Right.
And nobody wants you to do anything.
Right.
But they ultimately put the permits together to say, yes, this would be a good thing for the park, it'd be a good thing for Maryland, and a good thing for schools.
Yep. And through that work, hundreds of thousands of kids have had their first interaction with the Chesapeake Bay, their first time really appreciating this system and being immersed in this because you persevered.
Yeah, so we're approaching 20 years now, and we've had up to 10,000, 12,000 kids a year that have come through in just the school program, and another 10,000 that came through in the community-based programs in the summer and the rest. So that's a lot of kids.
Yeah.
That's a lot of kids that have had a most unusual experience.
Yeah.
And I'm very proud of that.
Yeah. So what would you like to see happen over the next 5 to 10 years? Like, what's your vision for where this could go?
Well, my hope was that people would see education as an experiential learning environment where they would go back to creating the fun that inspires kids to inquire and keep moving and want to know more.
Right.
And so what I'd hope is that with all the transitions that are going on in education, a camp experience like this, so powerful on the experiential level, would ultimately start to impact the bigger education system so that they would start paying attention to really the way kids want to learn.
Right.
And not the blackboard textbook hand-me-down systems that we've been unsuccessfully using for years.
Right.
So I'm hoping that this will be an example where we can teach people better methods, better outcomes, and that kind of thing. I'm not always successful at the big picture, but I do know the little picture is working. The NorthBay experience is a powerful, well-recognized experience for years now.
Yep. So, John, what advice would you give people, especially I think about youth, in how they can really get out there and make an impact in the world, make an impact with kids?
Well, if your attitude is to make the world a better place and you're successful and you have some resource, well, then you need to follow your passion. And most people that are that successful have a passion to fix something, to make something better.
Right.
And I would say, and you don't have to do it yourself. It's one of these things where you can do it by partnering with somebody or finding somebody who's really good at what you want to accomplish and just empowering them. Follow your passion. Go partner with the people that'll make that difference with you.
Yeah. So I think summing up, I'd like to just hear, like, what do you see as the heart of NorthBay? What's the spirit of this place?
The heart of NorthBay is to just collect a totally group of kids together and give them an experience that is more fun and impactful than they've ever had. And this is more than just a Disneyland week.
Right.
This is the impact of being around other people like themselves in a different environment, removed from their safety net.
Yeah.
And then not only have it fun, but to give them a message where they really learn that they're responsible for the rest of their life. And the choices that they make will determine their outcome. And that one of those choices that's really at the top of the list is their education. They're responsible for it. If they pursue it, they can succeed.
John, after 20 years, what does it feel like when you come to NorthBay, when you walk on the campus and see these kids?
Well, it's always exciting to me, and to know that it's almost the same experience as it was 20 years ago. And I particularly like coming midweek to the end of the week, because the excitement of the kids builds their connection to the learning is built. You just see it in their faces. And I particularly like the noise in the dining room where it just goes on and on. They're having so much fun. And maybe even most particularly the evening show, where they really have the bonding and the messaging that you're trying to connect with. It's just exhilarating to see that after 20 years, it's having the same impact every single week that it did 20 years ago. So, yeah, it's exciting. And it tells me that we've done good things together. And so I love coming here to visit, experience this. And every time it's a joy in the heart every time you see it.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate the time.
Well, Rick, I've enjoyed being here today, and you are a major part of holding this whole thing together, and you're part of what I talk about when I say partnering. When I look at the energy that you put in, that combined with the passion that I had to start this, it's another proof of the fact that, boy, we can make the world a better place every day, and thank you for what you do.
We can together. Thank you. That's a wrap for this episode of the NorthBay Podcast. But remember, the conversation doesn't have to stop here. Outdoor learning is a movement, and we all have a role to play in making sure every student, no matter where they are, has access to the life-changing benefits of learning in nature. If you enjoyed today's discussion, be sure to subscribe, like, and share the podcast with others who believe in the power of learning beyond the classroom. And remember, outdoor school shouldn't be a privilege for the few, but rather a right for every student. See you next time.